Thank you very much indeed, Austin. I think everyone will agree that was an incredibly inspiring and rich and fruitful way to open this session for this morning. And I don't know about you, but I think I need a minute or two just to stop and think and reflect a little bit on all that we've heard before we go on. I find I need to look up for a minute and to look around at all of you. And the reason that I need to do that is because one of the things that really hit me from what we just heard was that image of a church that is bent over, bent down, looking down, so that vision is limited only to what is immediately around us, and that what is on the periphery is somehow blocked out, more difficult to see, more difficult to reach, and more difficult to make connections with. And that leaves me with a question that immediately came out of what Austin was saying. Where do we find healing for that? Where do we find healing for those burdens and those pressures and all those things that weigh us down so that we are bent down looking at the ground? And the other thing that really struck me was what must we change in the power of the Spirit to enable God's mission? That's really powerfully hit me when Austin was talking about that. So I have made some notes and some questions. I've got lots of comments and ideas from what we've heard, but I hope you're doing the same thing and that we'll be able to gather up some of those questions, some of those thoughts and comments. We haven't got enough time to take lots of questions this morning, but it would be nice if you could feed those back to us so that we can continue to build on that richness. We don't lose any of it. And I know that you'll all want to go away and read the book. So now it's my enormous pleasure to move us on and to invite Selina Stone, to come and talk to us about justice at the intersections. Thank you, Selina.
Good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here, to be following Austin. What a task I have. My name is Selina. I'm a theologian working in London, but I'm a Brummie, as you can probably hear. And it is really a joy to be here to speak with you all about justice at the intersections and the themes of social justice. And of course, to imagine what role cathedrals might play at this particular time in our nation's life. And I will leave most of that to you because you know cathedrals much better than I do. I've loved cathedrals for as long as I can remember. Walking into them as a young child on staycations and feeling very small but being reminded of the bigness of God as I felt that way in cathedrals around our country. And so I think of cathedrals of having such an important role in our cultural life and in our national life. But one of my most recent experiences of being in a cathedral was with my colleague Rennie Choi, who has recently written a book called Ancestral Feeling, in which he's reflecting on notions of Christian heritage, and particularly what it means for us to think about Christian heritage as not just English heritage. And as part of this work, she's been taking people like me from ethnic minority backgrounds on tours of cathedrals in order to examine how we experience these spaces. And so I walked around St. Paul's Cathedral with her for the first time as a person observing the space, reading all of the little bits of information, looking at all the monuments, and realizing how much I had never noticed them before. I go to cathedrals often. I sometimes have preached in cathedrals or gone for evensong or just to pray during the day. But I've never gone around with eyes to read what's actually there and to take a good look at the monuments. And so as we walked around the St. Paul's Cathedral, we saw all kinds of people being remembered as memorials were put up for historical figures, many of whom were responsible for the murder of indigenous peoples around the world through colonialism, in the name of Christ and the British Empire. And it transformed the space for me. And we had a little reflection on this, on whether I would have preferred to be blissfully unaware of all of this as I go into St. Paul's. But it opened up the question of how these spaces actually feature. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time thinking about cathedrals and monuments because that's not why I'm here today. But I think it raises that question of how do we reflect on spaces? It reminds us that cathedrals are spaces which tell stories and which have a role in telling particular histories, and therefore may also have an important role in telling the contemporary stories that we are living and experiencing. And as I thought about this, it reminded me of the story of Jesus and his disciples, when in Matthew 24 they are around the temple and the disciples call Jesus' attention to the temple, and he uses the temple as they're admiring its grandeur to speak about himself and the wider story that God is telling, that his body will be broken down in 3 days and come back from the dead. And so it gives us that invitation, if we were ever weary of this, to reflect theologically on spaces and how spaces might lead us to think about the bigger questions of our lives, the stories that we're living and the stories that are being lived around us. And as I think about this theme, I also carry with me today a conversation I was having last week with a man in my family who works in Birmingham on reducing youth violence. And he was called as part of his job to go and visit the family, a man and a boy who had chased and killed a boy near where we live. And this man in my family called me up to wrestle theologically, because this is what happens to me now, with what he should do. This is a white man and a white boy who had been part of a gang who had chased and killed a black boy in Birmingham, shouting racial slurs, and had stabbed him to death. And were going to spend some time in prison, but were processing what had happened. This person in my family was asked to visit them, so he's now like, what do I do with this? And this is the space in which I do theology. These are the things which are happening in our national life. And I wonder how our cathedral space is to help people to tell, share, and reflect on these stories. But I'm tasked by speaking about justice at the intersections, and this is a title I chose, so I've created this work for myself. But really, I think this task of thinking about justice at the intersections is about being able to hold together multiple stories. I often talk about this with my students because I think often we're trained to think only of one way of thinking of reality or one story. We want to think and talk about class and poverty only, or we want to only think about race, or only think about gender, or only think about disability. And when I think about justice at the intersections, what I'm realizing or alluding to is the fact that if we want to have a full picture of our world and our reality as it is, we have to make room for multiple stories. We have to recognize that multiple things can be true. We don't need to choose one story over others, but have a heart and an openness to listen and to hold together those tensions and nuances as we try to understand the complex world that we are now living in. And as I've been considering more and more this theme of social justice in the scriptures, and as a theologian I have to give us a good biblical reflection, of course, I have been reflecting on a story that you actually referenced, Austin, of the woman who comes into the temple who is bent over, and particularly the way that Jesus sees her coming in at the back and notices her when nobody else does. And if you don't remember the story, she comes into the synagogue one day, and Jesus calls her to the center and heals her. And the Pharisees get very angry about this because it's a Sabbath, and Jesus is not supposed to be doing that on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees say, you should come back on another day. We're not healing today. Come back, Tuesday, for example, and you'll be more than free to be healed. And Jesus says, if you had an ox who fell into a ditch, you would pull them out. But this sister is here, and you're saying she should not be healed. And there's a few things I think that can speak to us today about this passage. The first thing is where it happens. It happens in a synagogue, in a place of worship, in a place where people gathered. Jesus seemed to like to be around people for the most part, though also had, I think, his introvert moments when he went away with his friends, just a few of them, or to pray. But Jesus is happy to be in the place where the people are, where he knows they will be open to learning, to offering sacrifices, to speaking. He wants to encounter community. But though he is there in the synagogue, he's not uncritical of the dynamics at play. He is aware of the issues of power that are playing out in that very moment. He's not seduced by power and therefore wanting to please the Pharisees and be affirmed by them. He's very willing to walk in the kind of integrity that means he will annoy those who have authority in that space. But Jesus sees the woman who's hunched over at the back because he has time to see and he has eyes to see. He sees her not simply as a grey figure with no real identity, but he recognizes the particularity of who she is. He recognizes she has particular needs. She's on the edge of things. She can't see everything that everybody else can see. She has a kind of disability that makes taking part in social life difficult. She may have even been considered cursed by God because of her disability. Who knows the many ways in which she was ostracized and pushed to the side by those who should have known better. But Jesus centers her and calls her forward, out of the shadows into the heart of community. And he frees her from everything that has been oppressing her. And in this way, she experiences the goodness of God. And the religious leaders are angry because it seems that Jesus has broken the law of keeping the Sabbath, because their love for law and protocol and legalism surpasses their love for this woman. And Jesus exposes their hypocrisy because in reality, they will make their way around the rules when it suits them, but not for the sake of this sister of theirs. And this has become to me one of the core texts in thinking about justice, principally because it brings a question of solidarity right to the fore, of what it means to take action that stands in line with those who find themselves on the edges of our communities. And so this theme of solidarity is really what I would hope to explore a little bit with you today. And in order to do this, I want to draw on the thoughts of Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, who is a Mujerista theologian. By this, she is a Latin American feminist theologian, thinking principally about how God reveals God's self in the lives of women who are overlooked, who are living life at the intersections of multiple forms of oppression and injustice. The socioeconomic, gender, international relationships that retain a neo-colonial edge, which continue to impoverish Latin America. And she does have theology in this particular context. And so she's helpful to us, I think, as we try to pay attention to the complexities of our current life and the multiple layers of inequalities that we are talking about today. And what she helps us to recognize, first of all, is that solidarity is an action and not a feeling. And this might sound obvious to some of us, but she expresses concern, and I'll quote her directly, that solidarity is understood as a disposition. One can have it for a while, put it aside for whatever reason, and then pick it up again. Solidarity has come to mean agreement with, and that is given an ephemeral sense of supporting others that has little or nothing to do with actual praxis. If the true meaning of solidarity was understood, she asserts, and it was intended, then visible radical change will be happening in the lives of all of us who endorse it with our applause. Solidarity is not a matter of agreeing with, of supporting, liking, or being inspired by the cause of a group of people, though all of these might be part of it. Solidarity goes beyond all of them. And so we can be sure then from this description that solidarity is born from a love of God that has come to us not only in sentiment and in feeling, but in action. The love of God is shown to us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. God does not have loving feelings. God is love. God embodies and enacts love in our lives. And therefore, when we talk about loving our neighbor as we are loved, then this must also take part in our action, not only in our sentiments. She continues to explore solidarity as something which demands critical reflection on who the excluded are among us. She speaks about solidarity as understanding the connections that exist and the interconnections between oppression and privilege, between the rich and the poor, the oppressed and the oppressors, and the oppressors. And so she asks us to consider and to name, therefore, who are those people who we might consider to belong in these categories. And I do think there are multiple ways in which this can work, and as I said at the start, I don't think we can oversimplify oppressor and oppressed language because there's so much complexity in all of this. But what is true, I think, is there are multiple forms of power and exclusions at working in our society at the moment that have been made ever more evident to us in the course of the pandemic. And though in our reflections in light of the pandemic, we often think about the world changing, I always want to say, had it changed, or have we just seen it a bit more clearly? Exploring the interconnections between oppressions and privileges means that we have to look at the fact of who has access to resources and who doesn't, who gets to do things in the way they want and who has to go along with the decisions other people make, whose voices and perspectives dominate conversations and discussions, and even in our telling of stories, that itself is an act of vulnerability. We talk about listening often and the sharing of stories, and yet even in that, there's required a level of vulnerability by those who lack privilege, of how those stories will be heard, interpreted, reinterpreted, and even weaponized. Reflecting on privilege and power means asking who gets trusted with power, who do we imagine are those people who can lead, and who are those who we think should be led. And this, of course, takes multiple forms in our society and even in our churches. Solidarity then demands critically reflecting on the dynamics of power, and then we've been willing to take action to reorder those dynamics in ways which work towards justice and peace. Isasi Diaz then realizes that solidarity must include developing spaces of support for those who themselves are struggling to reorder the world in ways which are geared towards justice and righteousness. Cohesiveness for communities of struggle is core in her definition of solidarity. Spaces where the well-being of minorities and those who are marginalized can be prioritized. Spaces of healing where stories can be told in a safe place and those who are victimized are not scrutinized, but recognized in all of their dignity and worth. And overall, her definition of solidarity leads us to see solidarity as something that must replace charity when it comes to expressing neighbor love. Charity, she says, is the word most often used when talking about love of neighbor, but it has been implemented mainly through a one-sided giving. A donation almost always of what we have in abundance. Giving is an ethical behavior, she suggests, only if it is understood and carried out within the context of solidarity. And so she does not deny here that charity is valid and important, that it has value. And in the space of so many crises that we're all living through, charity seems like the only basic level of kindness that we might offer to our neighbors who are in need. But it is in her definition unethical when it is only one-sided, meaning that those who are the givers assume that they have something the other needs without recognizing that the person in material need might also have something to offer in exchange. And I suspect that these assumptions can also seep into who we think of as responsible, as those who lead, those who should speak, those who should be quiet, those who we want on our team, those who we think we can afford to live without. Giving for Isasi Diaz must be done within the context of solidarity, within a commitment to champion the dignity of those who are often overlooked and the elevating of their voices. It involves the reordering of unjust relationships between individuals, but also groups and in organizations. And this is the kind of action that is needed for justice within biblical texts and within the biblical imaginations. It is the kind of justice and solidarity which allows Jesus to see the woman at the back of the synagogue and call her to the center. Charity within this broader commitment then is ethical because it's part of a wider strategy that recognizes that short-term solutions are inadequate for the reordering of the disorder of our public life. And since solidarity is core to neighbor love, then it is worth noting that as with all forms of love, it is transformative for the lover as well as for the loved. We often think about injustice as giving certain privileges to others over other people. But in the thinking of Paulo Freire, who thinks about education and liberation, His words, I think, are quite important in recognizing the ways in which oppression and inequalities dehumanize the oppressor as well as those we think of as oppressed. We see evidence of this, I think, in our common life when we consider the impact of gender biases on men's mental health and well-being as they seek to live up to the norms that we say masculinity must demand. Or the ways in which the idolizing of white European theologies and philosophies have impoverished churches in Europe who have lacked the richness of global perspectives on God and faith and spirituality. Justice and solidarity therefore benefits all, including those we might think of as privileged. And in my own work and life, this work of solidarity, I think, has been at work most poignantly in my work as a community organizer before I was a theologian. And I was trained in East London in the art of organizing, which was a space in which I saw what solidarity might actually mean, as communities who didn't know each other would listen to one another's stories, share their interests, and act together on matters of shared concern. And in the Centre for Theology and Community, where I had the joy of working for several years, we would work with churches on creating a culture that would enable them to enact solidarity in communities. And we spoke about 7 hallmarks of an organized church, which could also be an organized cathedral potentially. I'll leave that to you. The first hallmark was the integration of theology, spirituality, and action, meaning that what we say we believe should align with what we do. What we pray and what we say we believe about God should be at work in our activities and in our commitments. The second thing was a relational culture, which I think Austin already touched on so well, in how we create spaces of listening and the sharing of stories and the finding of common stories. The third is a reorganizing to focus on people, that where programs take precedent over humanity, that we probably need to do a bit of rethinking. Number 4 is that leaders are developed through public action, that the recognition of public roles and the importance of taking action beyond the walls of the church for leaders is so important. Number 5 is shared power and responsibility, as we find ways of sharing all that it takes to decide on action and to enact it in communities. Number 6 was an instinctive readiness to work with those beyond the church's walls, an instinct toward neighborliness and neighborly love. And number 7 was the telling and embodying of the Christian story. And so cathedrals are undoubtedly spaces which have a particular position in relation to the church and wider society. And so imagining how these 7 hallmarks might play out in cathedrals are helpful, but I think there are also some overarching questions on the theme of solidarity that you might want to reflect on in your cathedral groups. The main one being, what does it mean for cathedrals to be places of solidarity? How do cathedrals go beyond sentiment to being places of action? And this is relating to what you're probably already doing, not only what needs to be done, but how could that be a deeper commitment? How might cathedrals reflect on their own power and the forms of power and disempowerment taking place within and beyond them? And what role might cathedrals have in going beyond charity to challenging unjust structures, which many of you who have memorized the 5 marks of mission will recognize? And to what extent cathedrals might provide spaces or hubs of support for those groups who are struggling against multiple forms of injustice in our society. Thank you.